All right, so this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet. We've got chapter 23, section 2, The American Revolution. So when we look at the political revolutions, there are pretty much four, or at least four categories to think of. The first revolution is the American Revolution, and it is important for happening first. The second is the French Revolution, which is important because it probably has the most significant consequences, having happened directly in the heart of the European continent. Third, there is the Haitian Revolution, which is most significant because of it being a slave revolt. And then the fourth are just something that we call the Latin American revolutions. And those are significant not just for each independent country which gained their independence, but because what makes the Latin American revolutions more unique to the other three is their close connection with the Catholic Church, whereas the other revolutions don't have that same attachment. So we'll be focusing in this section purely just at this one, the American Revolution, again, being important because it is the first of these political revolutions and kind of sets the stage for everything else. So when referring to the American Revolution, we want to look at some of the causes, right? So frontiers and taxes. In fact, last section, 23-1, we talked about the preconditions for revolution, for what made it possible. And among those preconditions were very expensive wars. The 7 Years' War was a war that was fought in North America. It was a war in which the British were victorious, but led to an enormous war debt. And the question for the British was to how to pay off the war debt. And one of the major ways is that the British are going to turn to passing new taxes, specifically on the English colonies in North America, which only agitate the colonists even more. But taxes was only one part of the equation. There was also a lot of discontent over how the frontier was managed. So after the 7 Years' War was over, French land, right, now became essentially British land, right? So it's not French anymore, it's now British. And many settlers wanted to settle on this newly won land. I mean, this was territory that the British won from the French in their eyes fair and square. The problem is that this was probably really Indian land, to be quite honest. It had been occupied by Native Americans for much, much longer. And there is, you could even say that the British or even the French had no right to give it to the British to begin with, but nonetheless they did. And this leads to renewed violence and conflict. Pontiac's rebellion is a violent conflict between English settlers and Native Americans. Pontiac was the Native American leader. And as a result, the British passed the Proclamation Line of 1763, which prohibited where colonists could live, right? Which, as you might imagine, did not make the colonists very happy, right? Sad face. If we go to this map here, this map does not indicate where the proclamation line is, but it is a map that shows the American Revolution to where we'll get to in a moment. But pretty much the proclamation line was kind of right in this sort of region right here, right? Really prohibited and forbade British colonists from crossing over into this territory. That way there could be less violence. Pontiac's rebellion was occurring in this particular area here. So a lot of conflict, skull and crossbones for the violence that occurred there. There you go. And so this was one arena in which the colonists were displeased with British authority. But probably the more important one was over these economic issues of taxation, which of course is partially being put into place because of the huge war debt Great Britain owns. Now, one thing that made the English colonies a little bit different than their Spanish and French counterparts was the fact that the British had, or at least the English colonists in North America, had a significant amount of political autonomy, and that local governments had for a very long time, we might say a long history of self-rule. You know, assemblies like the House of Burgesses, which was the legislature in Virginia, you know, that had been around since like 1617 or something like that. And so in places like Virginia, and this was true for a lot of the other English colonies, they had been having their own elections, making their own laws, raising their own taxes. They had more or less been governing themselves for a very long time. And that's why these particular new laws and new practices that govern the colonies, why they hit so much harder in the English colonies as opposed to other areas, because there was this long history and tradition of self-rule there. Although the British did regulate trade, for the most part, they only regulated trade, what we might call, we'll say maritime trade. This was also something called external trade. So anything that left the colonies, right, imports or exports, the British regulated that for a very long time. Now, a lot of the colonists smuggled and continued to trade illegally. You know, recall something like the theory of mercantilism and the Navigation Acts, and the way that the British really prohibited the English colonists from trading with any other countries. So regulation of trade had been on the books, but especially in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, it only increases. There was a whole series of new taxes, including taxes that cracked down on smuggling, but by far the most important of these taxes was the Stamp Act, which taxed printed documents. This was a way for the British Empire to raise money, right? The whole purpose of the Stamp Act was to raise money. And ultimately that money would be used, right, if we go back here, to pay down the war debt, right? That was the idea. However, these taxes were completely internal. In other words, they taxed printed documents within the colonies that never left or were never imported there. And because this was a new precedent, it created a lot more protests. It specifically flew in the face of this idea of political autonomy, in which the colonists had passed their own internal taxes for a very long time, ultimately led to huge boycotts. We might also say riots, and eventually the British repealed or backed down. They got rid of the Stamp Act because the colonists had protested so much. Other taxes were put on the colonists, including taxes on tea, which were a little bit more acceptable because tea was something that was external, it was something that was imported. But still there were parts around the colonies that continued to resist any effort by the British to raise taxes, namely those in Massachusetts. Here you can see a tax collector being tarred and feathered and having tea poured down his throat because these colonists in particular did not want to pay the tea tax. The British responded to these protests and boycotts and riots by sending in more troops, more authority. In 1770, in Boston, British professional soldiers opened fire on English colonists, killing 5. This event was known as the Boston Massacre. It only increased tension between the colonists and the mother country. And this fundamental issue over taxation never really got resolved. On the one hand, you had the colonists insisting upon that Enlightenment idea of consent of the governed. And all of these taxes, right? You know, we'll take the Stamp Act in particular, we'll take the tax on tea. All these things came from the Parliament. And the Parliament had no direct representation. Run out of room here. Representation from the colonies. And so the major slogan leading up to the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. And that's what ultimately led to really what is the last crisis, and that is the crisis over tea. Great Britain passed the law in 1773 called the Tea Act, pretty much forcing the colonists to buy tea from Great Britain. because British tea was the only tea that you could legally buy in the colonists were forced to pay the tea tax, which was a violation of the principle of no taxation without representation, which again is just an offshoot of the Enlightenment principle that governments are there by the consent of the governed, in other words, the social contract. And in I think it was 1773 or 1774, the residents of Boston dumped tea in the Boston Harbor rather than pay the taxes for it. And this event was known as the Boston Tea Party. As a result, Parliament in Great Britain dissolved the assemblies. The assemblies were the elected governments of the colonies. And really, when Great Britain dissolved the Assembly of Massachusetts, the other colonies came together, created and met at what's known as the Continental Congress, and said that Parliament needs to seriously reconsider their position. In the meantime, fighting breaks out in Boston. At the Second Continental Congress, the colonies decide that it's time to completely separate from Great Britain and declare independence. George Washington was chosen to be in charge, so he led the Continental Army. And one of the main contributing factors to pushing most Americans to think about independence was Common Sense, published by Thomas Paine. So Thomas Paine is the author of Common Sense. Common Sense made the case for independence. It was the most widely read material in the 13 English colonies before the American Revolution. Thomas Paine wrote it in a way in which everyday people could understand, and so it was very appealing to the masses. And with war and fighting already taking place in Boston, with the British hiring professional soldiers from Germany, Hessians, with the British trying to get Native American tribes to fight against their own colonists in North America, it was on July 4th, 1776, that the Second Continental Congress decided to declare independence. In the Declaration of Independence, which was written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, it reasserts the idea of popular sovereignty, that is the right for people to rule themselves, and individual rights, which was, of course, John Locke's idea. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson stated that all men were created equal, that they are entitled to natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and that if governments do not protect those rights, then the people have the right to alter or abolish their government. In other words, that governments also require the consent of the governed. So this was a major, what we might call a major kind of starting point for what would become or what would characterize all of the political revolutions in the Atlantic world. So maybe a major starting point. However, even after the colonists declared their independence, for all of these reasons, they still needed to fight a war. The most powerful tribe in the area, the Iroquois Confederacy, did not commit. We might say strongly to either side. The Iroquois Confederacy, made up of a number of tribes located in what is kind of northeastern United States today. Instead of committing strongly towards the American side or strongly towards the British side, instead didn't really commit to either side. And the tribes that made up the Confederation instead either fought for the Americans, fought for the British, or fought for both. Joseph Brant, for example, he was a Mohawk, and he fought for the British. Built a really strong reputation. He was honored in Great Britain, considered to be a very admirable and brave fighter for that side. Initially, the war went very badly for the American side. George Washington was nearly captured at the beginning of the American Revolution. A lot of the early battles were a failure. However, the Battle of Saratoga was the turning point After this battle, this was a U.S. victory. And this was the battle that decided or really gave the French a reason to join the American side. And so it was with French involvement that Yorktown, the last battle, also being a U.S. victory, led to U.S. victory in the war. The Peace of Paris finally signed in 1783. Great Britain acknowledged that not only they had lost the war, but acknowledged that the United States was a new and independent country. So the reason why the American Revolution is so important was because after all this fighting had taken place, after Thomas Jefferson and others had declared pretty much the reasons for breaking away, that governments are not about kings ruling over subjects. They're not about the divine right because God puts kings on earth to rule over people. Everything that's encapsulated in the Declaration of Independence is pretty much put forward as the reason for why governments exist. And if we look at the big picture, let's go back to 1770. And if you look around the world in 1770 and say how many governments exist based on Enlightenment principles, how many governments are based off of popular sovereignty and individual rights? The answer is 0, right? You fast forward to today, 2021, and today it's in some sense, every single government is based on some sort of enlightened, democratic, republican principle. There are a few exceptions, right? There are a couple of monarchies still existing. But if you think to yourself in the whole scope of world history, how do you go from every single government on the planet being an absolute monarchy ruled by hereditary bloodlines to today where every single government has some sort of election process, save a few, for example? This is really why the American Revolution is important, because it's the first one to start that trend, right? It's the first one to start that trend. So Yorktown, last battle, U.S. victory in the war, Peace of Paris, first, we'll call it Enlightenment nation, right, in the world. That's why it's important. Now, it was a pretty bumpy road at first, right? So after the United States declared its independence and then won the war, which was important because without winning the war, no United States exists, it now was up to the U.S. to begin to write down what their governments were all about. There were governments written at the state level, right? And in those, there are 13 states, and there was one national government. So in total, 14 governments were created following the conclusion of the American Revolution. All of them, in general, sought to limit executive authority. That is essentially to say that any position like a governor or they didn't have presidents or prime ministers yet, but we'll just say governor, was limited. That more power to people. Some of them included a Bill of Rights, which was a list of protections against the government. And the national government was called the Articles of Confederation. So this is the first constitution in U.S. history. Now, one thing that they call the people who wrote the national government the founding fathers in U.S. history. I guess if you're from another country, you probably don't call them the founding fathers, but they're referred to as the founding fathers. One thing that they did in the Articles of Confederation government was to really limit this thing. So, for example, not only was executive authority limited in the Articles government, it was a government that had no executive, fearing that creating an executive would be too much like a king, and that king, or in this case a president, would be too likely to abuse their power. The Articles of Confederation government was made weak on purpose, right? Fearing that an overbearing government might abuse its power. However, in the short run, it actually turned out too weak to function. It couldn't pay down, or it couldn't handle the economy, couldn't handle things like national defense, And so the founding fathers then met at the Constitutional Convention to create a new government for the US, a maybe more balanced government. And this is what the Enlightenment thinkers had to deal with, and this is what really a lot of new governments around the world that go through a similar revolutionary process have to deal with. On the one hand, you want the government to be democratic, right? Try and spell that again. Democratic. Right? Because governments are supposed to be by the people. Right? That's the idea anyways. But on the one hand, it could also be so democratic that it really doesn't function all that well. Can a government be too loose to the point where there is chaos, right? Where there is anarchy? And many of the founders believe so. Instead, that perhaps the government needs to be a little bit more efficient, right? That it needs to be effective. In other words, to make decisions like defending the nation, like paying back and getting the economy recovered, that more power needs to go into fewer hands who can make those decisions. People who are knowledgeable about the information at hand, people who are in the know, right? Whereas the democratic process there might be too many ill-informed people doing this. But you don't want a government that's so effective that it's tyranny or tyrannical, that so few hands of people can rule over so little. So it's trying to find this balance, and that's what really creating these governments are about. Creating one that is democratic enough, right? Democratic enough to be by the people, but not too democratic that it's just chaos and anarchy. And it's creating a government that's effective and strong and can do the job, but not so strong that it's tyrannical, right? And what the founding fathers essentially came up with was the Constitution, which is more balanced. It is the second national government in American history. George Washington presided over it. It created 3 branches, right? An executive, which would be a president, kind of like a king, but not really, but not the same, right? So the idea behind the president was that when there was a national emergency, like, for example, something like national defense, one person could be a decision maker rather than having a whole bunch of people try and debate over an issue that needs immediate attention. These 3 branches of government were designed to check and balance one another. That way, so no one branch becomes too powerful. So, for example, one of the powers that the founders gave the legislative branch, which is the branch that is elected by the people, is the power to impeach the executive, right? So impeachment is the process to remove the president or remove a person from even the judicial branch if they abuse their power. It also created a system of government between the federal and state governments. Remember, the state governments still exist, right? There's now a national government that is a little bit more powerful, but there are some powers that the state can do, there are some powers that the national government can do, and there's some powers that they share. So back and forth in this federalist system, certain powers are relegated on, these certain levels. Again, we refer to this simply just as the Constitution. Now, one thing that we need to say about the American Revolution, and that is in some ways it was not revolutionary enough, right? And one example of that is that both slaves and women were excluded from political process. So, for example, when it came to slavery, slavery was only gradually abolished in the North, where it became more entrenched in the South. And for women, they gained no voting rights.